All right, folks, so this is the Garmin Instinct Crossover. I'd argue that this is probably one of the most unique watches that Garmin's come out with yet. So when Garmin first came out with the original Instinct, well, that was certainly an interesting watch in itself with its retro style and was certainly different than any other Garmin watch at that time. And I think it was a big gamble on Garmin's part, but as we've seen, that gamble certainly has paid off. I mean, I see Garmin Instincts everywhere. And here's the next gamble, the Instinct Crossover, which takes the Instinct concept and kind of blends it with elements of a traditional watch, like real analog watch hands, as well as numbers around the display. And I will come out right out and say that I don't necessarily think this watch is for everyone, but I do think it may be for someone who wants the durability, sport capability, and health features of the Instinct 2, but wants something that maybe looks a little more distinct, that can absolutely be still used for sports in the outdoors, but also can kind of serve double duty with a bit dressier feel to it. The original Instinct and the Instinct 2 are designed with a functionality-first mindset, and what the crossover aims to do is merge those with the traditional watch design. But what happens here, though, is that these additional elements can make a slight difference in regards to functionality as well as usability. And the crossover also does have a couple other things that are different than the Instinct 2, one of which is a new GPS chipset. So in this video, we're going to go over how exactly the crossover differs from the Instinct 2, not only with all the design differences, but how those differences actually translate into real-world use for sports in the outdoors, as well as just overall everyday use. And then just like all my reviews, I'll be going into a lot of detail into the actual sports and fitness performance of it, including GPS accuracy, heart rate accuracy, as well as altimeter accuracy. And if the information in this video does help you out at all, don't be shy about hitting that like button down below. So from a feature standpoint, the Instinct Crossover is everything and just a little bit more than what you get with the Instinct 2, which by the way is already a big upgrade over the original Instinct. So with the Instinct Crossover, just like the Instinct 2, you get tons of sport profiles, including all the typical stuff like running, both indoors and outdoors, cycling, both outdoors and indoors as well, tons of outdoor recreation profiles like downhill skiing, backcountry skiing, kayaking, stand-up paddleboarding, indoor rock climbing and bouldering, plenty of gym profiles, including strength training and high-intensity interval training, pool swimming, open water swimming, as well as multi-sport and triathlon modes, which by the way was something that was added to the Instinct 2, which was kind of a big missing feature from the original Instinct. And then in addition to that, the Instinct Crossover also gets all the training and performance feedback that comes on the Instinct 2, like VO2 max, their training status and recovery, and even support for cycling power meters. And speaking of power, the Instinct Crossover also can collect wrist-based running power directly from the wrist without having to have an accessory, but you also can collect this with something like an HRM Pro Plus heart rate strap. And then on the health and recovery side of things, the Instinct Crossover collects your HRV or heart rate variability. It has Garmin's advanced sleep tracking that can track your sleep stages. It can track your SpO2 levels, steps, floors climbed, all that good stuff. So basically, if you look at the feature list for the Instinct 2, the Instinct Crossover has it. And then in addition, it does share the same sort of overall design theme, I guess you could say, of the Instinct, where it has the retro G-Shock style look to it. It has nice textured buttons, although a slightly different texture, but all the buttons have a positive clicky feel to them. And also has an integrated style watch band, which is removable, by the way, but these stock watch bands are great though, where they're comfortable, stretchy, and also long, so you can even wear it over a light jacket. What sets the crossover apart from the Instinct 2 though are those real analog watch hands on top of the LCD display, but they also went ahead and added some premium materials to it, like some stainless steel touches, and also numbers on a new dual layer bezel that add some depth to the look and feel. And if that wasn't enough, they even made those numbers glow in the dark. It truly is melding one end of the spectrum with the other, and it certainly still does take quite a bit of inspiration from Casio's G-Shock line of watches. But by adding all those elements, it also does change some aspects that made an Instinct, well, an Instinct, where it acts a little bit differently in everyday use, during sports and workouts, as well as at night. So the first thing that makes it act differently is that they had to cover all these additional elements with glass that sits at the top of the watch versus being recessed like on the Instinct 2. The concave portion on the Instinct 2 creates a considerable amount of distance from the top of the bezel to the actual display, which in turn also protects it more than the crossover. But that also does factor into readability, since there's basically little to no distance from the actual display to the top of the glass on the Instinct 2, and that makes it super readable, along with the fact, of course, that the LCD display has tons of contrast. And that's where there's a little bit of compromise with the Instinct Crossover, where it's not as easy to see as the LCD display as the regular Instinct, where the distance from the top of the glass to the display makes a little bit of impact, along with the watch hands, of course, and the dual layer bezel, which add more visual elements for your brain to kind of have to filter out to focus on just the LCD display. The analog watch hands do move away though when you're interacting with the watch, as well as during workouts, so those aren't really a huge issue. And what is kind of cool too is that they actually utilize the hands on certain areas of the interface, like they literally act as a gauge on some data pages like the heart rate page. Now, is that difference in readability a big deal though? Well, it kind of depends on when you're using it. So for workouts and sports and stuff, it can make a little bit of a difference, but as you can see from some of these examples, it's still quite good because that display still does have a ton of contrast, and this is both outdoors as well as indoors. Yes, the LCD display on the regular Instinct is more readable, especially at a glance, but Crossover still works totally well. But here's something to consider just kind of like for everyday use. Well, since it has those analog watch hands, telling the time is super easy, basically all the time, pun intended. So for the number one reason why you may have a watch in the first place, it does that job astoundingly well since it has those analog hands. But that also translates to when it's dark, since the hands and numbers actually glow in the dark. There's no need for the backlight as long as the luminescent hands get a sufficient amount of light to charge them up. And that can be important for those of you out there who may be concerned with seeing blue light at night. Now, one thing I do want to point out though is that I did go ahead and apply a screen protector to it, since the glass is going to be more susceptible to scratches, since the top of the glass doesn't sit below the surface like on the Instinct 2, which is more protected because of the raised edges. And for a couple other differences I wanted to go over, adding those additional elements did add a little bit of weight to it, where it's 65 grams versus 53 grams, at least for the solar versions. And it's also a little bit thicker at 16.2 millimeters versus 14.5 millimeters. And in sort of a weird way, I actually kind of liked how it was a little bit heavier, because in my mind, it made it feel just a little more premium. I know, kind of weird, but that's how my mind worked with the weight. But with the difference in height, overall not that big a deal. But I do like how the standard Instinct doesn't sit all that high off my 185 millimeter circumference wrist, but I really had no complaints about the Crossover either. Oh, and then in regards to the analog watch hands, the hands have not come out of alignment over the last few months that I've been using it, so that whole Revo Drive technology, or whatever they call it, seems to be working well from a durability standpoint. But if for some reason the watch hands do come out of alignment, you can adjust them as needed. Oh, and then I also didn't notice any polarization from the Crossover at some off angles, but there can be a little bit of glare though, since there's that distance from the glass to the top of the display. I also wanted to talk about battery life. Now, if you look closely at the battery life specs, there's actually some slight differences between the Instinct 2 and the Crossover, and that's due to a couple things. So first off, there's more moving parts with the Crossover, which can make a little bit of a difference. But if you compare these solar battery life specs, you also may notice that the Crossover doesn't have the same unlimited battery life claim as the Instinct 2 Solar. And the reason for this is that the solar charging area on the Instinct Crossover Solar is just a little bit smaller than the Instinct 2 Solar. And then one more thing that can make a difference is that these do have different GPS chipsets. But are those battery life differences a big deal? I mean, it still gets great battery life. I mean, really good battery life, in fact. But again, if you're looking for that potentially unlimited smartwatch battery life with enough sun exposure, of course, yeah, you may want to look at the Instinct 2 Solar. So now let's talk about GPS accuracy. So when it comes to tracking outdoor activities, the Crossover uses Garmin's multi-GNSS chipset, where it can access 5 different satellite systems, which utilizes more satellite systems than the Instinct 2. The Instinct 2 didn't really have any issues in the GPS accuracy department, by the way, but this new chipset allows access to more satellite systems, which could make a difference depending on where you are in the world. But one thing to note though is that the Crossover doesn't have the dual frequency or multi-band chipset like the ones that are found on the Garmin Fenix 7 Sapphire or the Epic Sapphire. Where this differs is that multi-band or dual frequency chipsets can access 2 different satellite frequencies at one time, basically leading to increased accuracy in challenging environments where satellite signals can kind of get iffy, like around really tall buildings and heavy tree cover. But even though the Crossover doesn't have the dual band technology, it still does quite a decent job, and I've got a good amount of tests to show you how it did. So starting out with just kind of a simple run around my neighborhood, as you can see here, the Crossover lined up nearly exactly the same as the other devices when it comes to the total distance. And then if we take a look at the actual GPS tracks, the Crossover did really well. Right here as I started out, the device in green wandered just a little bit, but then up here, the Crossover that's in orange wandered just slightly over here. Then over here, the device that's in dark blue wandered a bit, but basically overall, the Crossover did really well. And then for a bit longer example, here's a road bike ride, and the Crossover was basically the same as the other devices, so good to go there. And another thing I wanted to point out too is that the elevation gain collected with the Crossover's altimeter was also close to the other devices, as well as the corrected elevation figure in Strava. And again, in regards to the GPS tracks, nice and solid, where on the straight sections it held a nice straight line, and on the curvy sections it did a really good job as well. But for a bit harder test though, here's a run I did in the downtown area of Petaling Jaya in Malaysia, and this is a much more challenging test due to a lot of tall buildings that can interfere with satellite signals. So right here as I was starting out, you can see that 3 out of the 4 watches choose a little different line, with the Crossover and the Apex 2 kind of going close to the building a bit, and then the 955 Solar sort of going into the street, with the Enduro 2 in light blue being the most accurate, at least on this portion of the run. But after that, they all got pretty much back on track. Over here, we see that the Crossover wanted to kind of cross the street a little bit, and coincidentally right by these tall towers, but after that, things look good out of all of them. And then if we take a look at the lower portion of the run down here, all of them seem to agree pretty well and fall along right where I'm actually running. But then down here, we see the Forerunner 955 Solar and the Apex 2 Pro skirt into the buildings a little bit, but the Crossover held a nice solid line. And this portion right here, by the way, is under just kind of like a little canopy sort of thing on the sidewalk, so it definitely was a challenging scenario for a device to get a solid satellite fix. But then after that, there wasn't really too much exciting going on for the most part, and the Crossover did okay compared to all the other devices that actually do have the dual band or dual frequency chipsets. You certainly will see the Crossover wander here and there, but in general, it's very minor and there were really no huge misses or anything like that. So even though the Crossover doesn't have the dual band or dual frequency satellite chipset, it definitely still produces respectable results. As good as the dual band? Maybe not, but even the dual band devices had a hiccup here or there, and at the end of the day, the total distances all lined up. Oh, and one more thing before we get into heart rate accuracy is that I also wanted to go over how well the Crossover did at estimating distances running indoors on a treadmill, and on numerous runs, it was always pretty darn close to the recorded distance that was recorded on the treadmill. And what's nice too is that you do have the ability to calibrate the distance and align it with the treadmill distance after your run. And then for heart rate accuracy, the Crossover uses the same 4th generation Elevate heart rate sensor as the Instinct 2 Solar, and the Instinct 2 Solar produced really good results for me, so let's see how the Crossover did. So starting out with something on the easier side of things, here's an indoor bike ride, and it's pretty much all good stuff out of the Crossover. There were a handful of spots like here and here where it was like 2 beats per minute off, but other than that, this is essentially perfect. And then for an example for running, the Crossover did quite well here. In fact, the Polar OH1 that's in green actually had a couple hiccups, which was kind of surprising, nothing crazy or anything like that. And we do see a handful of spots where the Crossover was off by just a moment or two, but overall, this is basically exactly what I want to see. And then here's another run, and again, quite good results out of the Crossover. There was a little dip here and an ever so slight dip here, but the Crossover seems to do really well with heart rate for running. Now, taking it outside for some road biking, this is where we start to introduce more variables for a sensor to deal with, like vibrations and bumps in the road. And here's where you will encounter less accurate results than indoors, but still, the Crossover didn't have any huge misses or anything like that and stayed on track for most of the ride. We do see at the beginning where it took a moment or two to lock on a heart rate, which is kind of typical for a wrist-based optical heart rate sensor, but after that, it locked on. Right here, as I was stopped for a moment, it wasn't quite in line with the chest and arm heart rate monitors, but after that, it was solid through this steady state section here. Right here, though, we do see it take a little while to catch back up to the increase in heart rate, and then on the tail end of the ride, it was just ever so slightly shaky, but still, this is a very good result for riding outdoors. And then finally for weight training, this is basically one of the hardest activities for a wrist-based optical heart rate sensor to track accurately, and that has a lot to do with the fact that you're gripping onto the dumbbells, which means that you're flexing your wrist, and there's also a lot of varying arm movement, both of which can basically throw off these kinds of sensors. And the Crossover did okay here, not the most accurate I've seen, but also no huge misses either, where you can see that the trends line up. What's interesting too is that with weight training is that you even see variance from the chest heart rate monitor to the optical arm heart rate monitor with this kind of workout. And then for the high intensity intervals at the end, what's funny is that the Crossover tracked the first few quite well, where we actually see some deviation between the chest and arm heart rate strap, but the Crossover did track the last few intervals a little bit high. You definitely won't expect as accurate results with this kind of an activity versus cardio-based activities, and this is still a totally usable result for weight training. So to wrap things up, when I first saw photos of the Crossover, I didn't exactly know what to think. It was a cool concept for sure, but just wasn't sure how that actually translates in real life. But when I actually had it in my hands, that changed things completely, and it's truly kind of a stunner in person. The photos simply don't do it justice, and seeing all those design elements along with a slightly more premium look and feel do make this a very unique, but also still quite functional watch, and I'm a big fan. But what I also think is kind of neat about the Crossover is that the Instinct itself, it is very noticeable, very much in a good way, not only for its distinct look, but also all those bright colors that are available. But the Crossover is noticeable kind of in its own way, maybe in a little more subtle, like, wait, what is that sort of way, where it's almost like a topic of conversation. But again, if you're someone who bought the Instinct or Instinct 2 because of its function first design, that's probably still your best bet. But if you've enjoyed your Instinct, but were maybe looking for something with a few more dressier aspects to it, with a bit more premium look, and something that can serve a bit more double duty, that's what the Crossover is all about, and you still get all the features of the Instinct 2 without much compromise. Anyhow, if you have any questions about the Instinct Crossover that I didn't cover in this video, make sure to leave those in the comments section down below. And on your way down there, if the information in this video did help you out at all, don't be shy about hitting that like button, and also subscribing to the channel for plenty more sports tech videos that are coming soon. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.